It's one of those questions that feels simple, maybe even a little tired, but it cuts right to the core of how we orient ourselves in the world. The classic. Is the glass half full or half empty?
It gets used so much because it points to something fundamental. Are you seeing the abundance or the lack? Are you predisposed to expect good outcomes, or are you bracing for the difficult ones?
Exactly. And this deep dive is all about unpacking that. We're going to move beyond the simple cliche of optimism good, pessimism bad,
Yeah.
and really explore these mindsets. They're not just fleeting moods. They're deeply ingrained ways of thinking that shape everything from our internal lives to our interactions with others, how we lead, and even our perception of global realities.
We've pulled together a stack of fascinating sources for this deep dive. We'll be drawing from psychological research on something called explanatory style, looking at leadership dynamics, exploring practical techniques for changing your thinking patterns,
Interesting.
and even diving into some surprising data on how people perceive global trends.
Our mission today is to help you understand these different perspectives, see what the research actually says about their nuanced benefits and maybe potential drawbacks, and perhaps most importantly, explore whether and how we can consciously navigate between them or even change our default settings.
Let's jump in then.
So to start, let's just ground ourselves with the basic definitions.
Right.
What are we really talking about when we say optimism and pessimism at their most fundamental level?
At its heart, optimism is pretty much the expectation of beneficial future outcomes. You look ahead and you anticipate good things happening.
Right.
Pessimism, conversely, is the expectation of negative future outcomes. You look ahead and you anticipate difficulties or problems. Pretty straightforward.
Simple enough on the surface.
Yeah.
But our forces point out that it's more complex than just a binary switch, right? Psychologists actually measure these tendencies.
They do. They
Yeah.
talk about dispositional optimism and dispositional pessimism. These are seen as stable personality traits or, tendencies. They use questionnaires like the Life Orientation Test, the LOT, to measure them.
Okay, the LOT.
And what's interesting from the research is that while optimism and pessimism scores on these tests are related, they aren't perfect opposites. They correlate around R equal to 0.5,
Okay.
which is only a moderate correlation. This suggests they capture distinct aspects of your outlook. You can have some degree of both or be low on both. It's not just two ends of a single pole for everyone.
That's a key nuance right away. It's not necessarily a zero-sum game. And one of our sources from BetterHelp really emphasizes that this isn't just about how you feel on a given Tuesday, it's about a crucial mindset, especially in contexts like leadership.
Absolutely. A leader's mindset, whether they lean towards optimism or pessimism, profoundly influences their actions and decisions. It really sets the tone for their team and impacts overall effectiveness.
Let's look at the optimistic leader first. What are the typical characteristics highlighted in the sources? What does that look like?
While optimistic leaders are often described as inspiring, their inherent tenacity and a fundamental can-do attitude help them remain firm and resilient when faced with adversity. They believe challenges can be overcome.
That positive attitude does seem like a natural fit for leadership, doesn't it? The sources list concrete benefits: improved team morale, greater adaptability within the team, and increased overall hardiness, the ability to bounce back from setbacks. They project a sense of confidence and possibility that can be, well, infectious.
They absolutely do. But it's crucial, and the sources make this point clearly, that pessimistic leaders also bring valuable characteristics to the table. It's not just about the potential downsides of pessimism.
Right. Pessimism isn't just about being negative. It can be a very functional orientation. What are those upsides in leadership?
A pessimistic leader tends to be significantly more detail-oriented. Because their inclination is to anticipate potential problems and pitfalls, they are often highly risk-averse. This cautious approach can lead to safer, more carefully considered, and, ultimately more intelligent decisions, avoiding potential disasters others might overlook.
So they're not just expecting the worst, they're actively looking for potential risks, like scanning the horizon for icebergs.
Precisely. They're likely to spot roadblocks far ahead and, importantly, prepare their team for those challenges. They might proactively develop and share coping strategies for anticipated problems.
So it's not just hand-wringing, it's strategic foresight. The source notes that this honest, realistic approach can actually build trust with the team. By acknowledging potential difficulties, the leader appears grounded and transparent. It keeps everyone accountable for potential issues and, counterintuitively perhaps, can strengthen team resilience because they are prepared for what might go wrong.
It shifts from a reactive stance to a proactive one. And this leads us to a third vital concept discussed: realism.
Realism. Okay. Is this just a middle ground, like being moderately optimistic or moderately pessimistic, or something else?
One source, drawing on the work of Martin Seligman, presents realism as more specifically a balanced, healthy form of pessimism. It's not about anticipating the worst, but about seeing things as they truly are, acknowledging both the good and the bad without distortion.
That distinction is interesting. How do we tell the difference between that pragmatic realism and the potentially debilitating, unhealthy pessimism?
The key difference, according to the short-form source, seems to lie in emotional investment. Realism is characterized by seeing things calmly and rationally, a clear-eyed assessment.
Okay.
Unhealthy pessimism, however, involves casting yourself in a dramatic story, often as the victim, why does this always happen to me? Or perhaps the villain, it's all my fault. It's the emotional baggage and self-referential drama layered onto the negative outlook.
That makes so much sense.
Sure.
Realism sounds grounded and functional, while deep pessimism sounds like being trapped in a negative narrative about yourself and your place in the world.
And it's worth noting that while we often praise optimism, there can be unhealthy forms of it too. One source gives the striking example of tornado survivors who, after enduring such a traumatic event, become unhealthily optimistic.
How so?
They develop a belief that because they survived one disaster, bad luck is used up and won't strike again.
Oh, wow. That sounds incredibly dangerous because it flies in the face of actual risk.
It is. It's a form of magical thinking, really, that ignores the very real need for preparedness, having a safety plan, understanding weather patterns, maintaining a shelter. It's not based on a sound assessment of reality.
Right.
So just as deep pessimism can be debilitating, unchecked, unhealthy optimism can lead to ignoring necessary precautions and putting yourself or others at risk.
So we're starting to see a more complex picture. Optimism anticipating good outcomes, pessimism anticipating bad, and realism seeing things clearly and calmly. But how does this actually work inside our heads? That's what Section 2 dives into, exploring the core mechanism. Explanatory style.
Right, this is where the psychology really deepens. Explanatory style is a truly powerful concept. It's defined as the habitual way people explain the causes of the events that happen to them.
Habitual. So it's like a default setting.
Pretty much. When something occurs, whether it's good or bad, your mind automatically assigns a cause, and your explanatory style is your consistent pattern for doing that.
It's like our internal detective, figuring out the why, and everyone has a typical approach.
Exactly. And while we have explanatory styles for both positive and negative events, the research consistently shows that the way we explain bad events has particularly strong correlations with vulnerability to things like depression and learned helplessness.
Oh.
So the focus is often on how we attribute cause for negative experiences.
Okay, let's break down that process. The sources talk about the 3 P's of explanatory style, especially when things go wrong. What's the first P?
The first P is personal versus non-personal. When something bad happens, do you see the cause as something about you, an internal flaw, a personal failing, or as something external to you, like the situation, the actions of others, or just circumstances?
Give me an example of the pessimistic explanation here.
The pessimistic explanation is internal. If you were laid off from your job, the internal attribution is, I'm a lousy employee, this happened because of my inadequacy. It's a judgment on your inherent self-worth or ability.
Ouch. And the more optimistic external take.
The optimistic explanation is non-personal. After being laid off, you might think, the economy is really bad right now, or the company was restructuring and my department was downsized.
External factors.
Right. Our sources give other examples. If you didn't get a promotion, the pessimistic internal explanation might be, I'm just not good enough. While the optimistic external explanation could be, the boss's nephew got the job, or it wasn't the right fit at this specific time.
That shift from internal blame to external factors feels so much less damaging to your self-esteem. The sources provide great illustrations, like the character Anjana blaming herself when your professor humiliated her, rather than attributing the cause to the professor's external inappropriate behavior.
Right.
Or Loki internalizing his parents restricting his friendships, seeing it as a reflection of something wrong with him, rather than their controlling behavior.
These examples powerfully show how internalizing the cause can lead to feelings of shame or inadequacy. The second P, then, is permanent versus temporary. Is the cause of this bad event something that is stable, fixed, and long-lasting, or is it temporary and changeable?
So does this setback mean things will always be this way because of this underlying cause, or is it just a temporary issue, like a blip?
Exactly. A pessimistic explanation sees the cause as permanent or stable. The sources give an extreme example of this, leading to a pervasive sense of hopelessness. This ruins everything. What's the point of living? Because the perceived cause feels unchangeable. Or, in Anjana's internal narrative, feeling, I will never be able to make improvements in my life due to a perceived permanent flaw.
That permanent attribution is incredibly debilitating. If the cause is forever, why would you invest effort in trying to change things?
It just crushes motivation. The optimistic explanation views the cause as temporary or unstable. After not getting a promotion, the optimist Ben might attribute it to something temporary like, I had a hangover that day, or I was just having an off week.
Something specific and fleeting.
Right. Anjana, as she works towards learned optimism, actively tries to reframe her perceived issues as transient obstacles she can overcome, not permanent character flaws.
That temporary framing is what allows for hope and effort. You can work on a temporary issue. Okay, the third P is pervasive versus specific. Does the cause of this bad event affect just this one isolated area of your life, specific, or does it spill over and ruin everything, global?
A pessimistic explanation sees the cause as pervasive or global. That same bleak example, this ruins everything, what's the point of living, implies the problem affects all aspects of existence. Totalizing.
Yeah. For Loki, his parents restricting one part of his life felt like it impacted his whole identity and sense of self, making the cause feel global.
It casts a shadow over everything else. The optimistic explanation, on the other hand, is specific or non-pervasive.
Right. The optimist would acknowledge the problem in one domain. Okay, not getting this promotion is a setback for my career right now. But they would qualify it by seeing the cause as specific to that domain. But this doesn't impact my relationship, my friendships, my hobbies, my health routine, my personal growth outside of work. Life continues and is perhaps thriving in other areas.
That helps contain the negative impact. It's a problem in one box, not a total system failure. So, if I'm explaining a bad event, a pessimistic style is internal, permanent, and pervasive. An optimistic style is external, non-personal, temporary, unstable, and specific, non-pervasive.
That framework, the 3 Ps, particularly how they are applied to negative events, is fundamental to understanding an individual's vulnerability to distress and lack of motivation when facing challenges. How do researchers actually measure this explanatory style? You mentioned questionnaires.
Yeah, the standard tool is often the attributional style questionnaire, the ASQ. Participants are presented with hypothetical scenarios, both good and bad, and asked to write down what they believe would be the major cause if this happened to them.
Okay.
Then they rate that cause on scales corresponding to those 3 dimensions. Is it due to you, internal, or something else, external? Is it going to be around forever, stable, or just for a while, unstable? Does it affect just this area, specific, or everything, global?
And you mentioned earlier that the way people explain bad events is particularly predictive?
Yes, the sources highlight this consistently. The scores derived from explaining negative events tend to have stronger and more consistent correlations with psychological outcomes than the scores for explaining good events. Specifically, attributing bad events to internal, stable, and global causes is strongly linked to increased symptoms of depression. While explaining good events with the opposite style, maybe external, unstable, specific, doesn't correlate as strongly with negative outcomes like depression. It seems our vulnerability to distress is heavily influenced by how we process setbacks.
That's a key insight. It's not just about celebrating wins, but about how you handle the losses, really. And this leads perfectly into the concept of learned helplessness, which Section 3 explores.
Learned helplessness is really the origin story for much of this research. It began in animal studies back in the 1960s. Researchers like Martin Seligman exposed animals, famously dogs, to uncontrollable aversive situations like electric shocks they couldn't escape from.
So no matter what the animal did, the bad thing kept happening. There was no contingency.
Exactly. Their actions had no effect on the outcome. Later, these same animals were put into a different situation where escape was possible, for example. They just had to jump over a low barrier to get to a safe area. The shocking observation was that the animals who had previously experienced uncontrollable shocks often wouldn't even try to escape. They would just lie there and passively endure the shock.
Wow. They had learned that effort was futile. They learned to be helpless.
Precisely. They learned that their actions didn't matter, leading to profound passivity. Psychologists quickly saw parallels in human behavior and adapted the experiments, often using things like unsolvable puzzles or noise bursts that participants couldn't control.
Right.
The results mirrored the animal findings. After experiencing uncontrollable events, people exhibited motivational deficits, less likely to try, cognitive deficits, difficulty learning later, and emotional deficits, sadness, low self-esteem. This passive resignation generalized to new situations where control was possible.
That cross-situational aspect is chilling. It's not just giving up in the original tough spot, but carrying that helplessness into new, potentially manageable challenges.
Yes, the phenomenon extends beyond the initial uncontrollable event, and it's strongly linked to anxiety and depression. The research clearly shows that experiencing uncontrollable bad events makes these psychological vulnerabilities much more likely.
Is there any way to prevent or reverse this? Is it permanent?
The sources mention some hopeful findings from the original research. Previous exposure to controllable events, successfully navigating challenges where your actions did make a difference, can immunize individuals against learned helplessness later. It builds a history of efficacy.
So building resilience through success.
Kind of, yeah. And actively demonstrating to someone who's become helpless that their actions can now produce results can help reverse the deficits. It requires reestablishing the link between effort and outcome.
That makes sense. Building a history of success, even small ones, can create resilience. The character Loki from the Rupkafa Journal article provides a human example of this learned helplessness, feeling utterly powerless after challenging childhood experiences, which led him to give up on trying to improve his life.
That feeling of powerlessness is the hallmark of learned helplessness. But thankfully, the story doesn't end there. The same researchers who uncovered learned helplessness also developed the concept that offers a way out. Learned optimism.
Turn to optimism, coined by Martin Seligman.
Yes. The core empowering idea is that you are not stuck with a pessimistic explanatory style or vulnerable to learned helplessness. You can actively learn to be optimistic by changing how you explain the causes of events to yourself.
So it's a skill you can develop, not just a trait you're born with, like cognitive fitness.
Absolutely. It involves becoming aware of your habitual, often negative self-talk, those automatic internal attributions using the 3 Ps, and then consciously challenging and changing how you think about the causes of things.
Challenging those automatic thoughts.
Right. Seligman's crucial insight, quoted in the source, is that the basis of optimism does not lie in positive phrases or images of victory, but in the way you think about causes.
That's such a powerful distinction. It's not about putting on a happy face or repeating affirmations. It's about fundamentally restructuring your internal logic for attributing cause and effect, the why.
It's a deeper cognitive shift, and the research supports its effectiveness. Developing a more optimistic explanatory style through these techniques can significantly help prevent or reduce symptoms of depression and anxiety.
The examples of Loki and Anjana in the Rupkatha article really bring this to life. Loki, by consciously changing his perspective and explanatory style, was able to conquer suicidal thoughts and actively improve his life.
Yeah, quite a turnaround.
Anjana, facing her own struggles with self-blame, made a conscious decision to confront her situation and, through deliberate effort, transformed herself into a more optimistic person.
They demonstrate that this isn't passive. It's an active process of cognitive change that builds resilience and fosters a sense of agency.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 4. What are the practical techniques and strategies we can use to actually shift our perspective and move towards a more balanced mindset? Because as we've seen, neither pure optimism nor pure pessimism is always ideal. It's often about flexibility and balance.
Flexibility is absolutely key. The BetterHelp article highlights the power of balance, particularly in leadership, through the concept of situational leadership.
Situational leadership.
Yeah.
That implies adapting your approach based on the specific context, right?
Exactly. It means recognizing that there isn't one universal best leadership style. Sometimes the situation demands a leader who is highly focused on potential problems and details, perhaps leaning into that risk-averse, prepared aspect of pessimism to ensure safety or quality.
Okay.
Other times, the situation calls for inspiration, motivation, and focusing on potential, leaning into the energy and possibility of optimism to drive the team forward.
So a good leader understands the specific task, the team's capabilities and needs, and the environment, and chooses the mindset and behaviors that are most effective for that situation.
It requires awareness and adaptability. And this adaptability extends to finding a personal balance between optimism and realism in everyday life, not just leadership. The sources strongly advocate for incorporating elements of realism.
Why is it so important to temper optimism with realism? We touched on the unhealthy optimism earlier.
Well, realism provides a grounded assessment of the situation. It allows you to make intelligent decisions based on the facts on the ground, acknowledging potential obstacles and constraints without losing the drive and belief in positive outcomes that optimism provides.
It sounds like combining the what is with the what could be, seeing clearly but still aiming high.
Precisely. Blending optimism with realism allows for better handling of complex situations. It guides teams, or yourself, towards success by enabling smart planning, effective risk management, and developing concrete strategies for overcoming anticipated problems.
So it's not blind hope.
No, it's hopeful action based on a clear understanding of reality. This is closely related to flexible optimism. Mentioned in another source, the ability to apply optimism strategically, tempered by realism when needed.
That blend feels incredibly powerful. Another important strategy for shifting perspective is developing a growth mindset. How does that fit in?
A growth mindset, as opposed to a fixed mindset, is the belief that your abilities and intelligence can be developed through dedication and hard work. It means seeing challenges not as threats or proof of inadequacy, but as opportunities to learn and grow.
And how does that connect to optimism and pessimism, or rather, explanatory style?
Someone with a growth mindset is less likely to fall into the permanent, pervasive attributions of pessimism when they face a setback. A failure isn't proof I'm terrible and always will be, internal, permanent, global.
The fixed mindset view.
Right. Instead, it's an opportunity to learn what didn't work this time so I can improve. That implies seeing the cause as temporary, specific, and perhaps related to effort or strategy, not inherent ability. This makes you more adaptable and decisive because you're not crippled by the fear of proving a fixed negative trait. It fosters a culture of learning and resilience.
It fundamentally changes the meaning of failure, doesn't it? From a verdict to data. Now let's get into a very direct therapeutic technique mentioned. Cognitive restructuring. Sounds intense.
It can be, but it's really practical. Cognitive restructuring is basically a set of therapeutic techniques designed specifically to help you identify unhelpful or inaccurate thinking patterns, deconstruct them, and rebuild them in a more balanced and accurate way.
This sounds like directly targeting and changing those pessimistic explanatory styles we discussed earlier, the 3 Ps.
It is, pretty much. The goal is to become highly aware of your maladaptive thoughts as they arise those automatic negative interpretations. Then you practice reframing them based on evidence and a more balanced perspective.
So the theory is?
The core theory is that by changing how you look at events, how you think about them, you can change the emotional and behavioral responses that follow. Change the thought, change the feeling, change the action.
Okay, makes sense. So how do I actually do this? Is it something you can do yourself?
While often guided by a therapist, the sources present techniques you can practice yourself. The first step is identifying distorted thoughts. You need to become an observer of your own thinking. Notice when and where these negative patterns show up. The example given is catastrophizing in testing environments.
Yes.
You get one question wrong and your automatic thought is, I'm going to fail this test, fail the course, and never graduate. That immediate leap to the worst possible outcome.
You have to catch yourself in the act of thinking the distorted thought. Okay. What's the next step after catching it?
The next step is questioning thoughts. Once you've identified a distorted thought, you challenge its validity. Ask yourself, how likely is this extreme outcome I'm imagining? What are all the possible outcomes, not just the worst-case scenario? Are there other ways to interpret this situation?
Applying some logic.
Yeah, it forces you to move beyond the automatic assumption. Then comes gathering evidence. This is powerful for challenging the distortion. You can keep a log of triggers and responses, but specifically, you list facts that support or contradict your negative thought or belief.
Like being your own lawyer.
Kind of. For instance, if you tend to personalize criticism, internal attribution, you'd look for evidence that the feedback was about the work or the situation, not about you as a person. If you globalize a failure, I'm terrible at math after a bad test, you'd look for evidence against that maybe you did well on homework, maybe you struggled with this specific topic, maybe your study habits were the issue, not your inherent ability.
You're actively seeking out reality to counter the distorted internal narrative. And after identifying, questioning, and gathering evidence, the final step is reframing.
Reframing is the process of replacing the distorted thought with a healthier, more balanced one based on the evidence you've gathered. It's not about replacing it with an unrealistically positive thought, but with a more accurate and helpful one.
The Healthline source provides a great, easy-to-remember framework for this process, the 3 C's.
Yes, a simple way to practice cognitive restructuring. Catch the thought, challenge the thought, and change the thought with a balanced alternative. It's a really practical tool for taking control of your internal dialogue.
That's incredibly actionable.
Oh.
Another practical strategy, particularly for dealing with feeling overwhelmed by a large task or project, comes from BYU Stress Management. They call it How to Turn the Mountain Back into a Molehill. I like that.
Me too. This technique directly addresses the paralysis that often comes from viewing a challenge through a pessimistic lens. The task feels too big, you feel too incapable, that sort of thing.
So how do you start shrinking that mountain? What's step 1?
Step 1 is to notice the pessimistic thinking and mental barriers. Become aware of the overwhelmed feeling and specifically ask yourself, what is it I'm telling myself about this project that feels so impossible or overwhelming? Get that internal script out in the open.
Acknowledging the negative narrative.
Okay. Yes. Then calm down. Use simple breathing exercises or other relaxation techniques. And crucially, remind yourself, I am stressed, not helpless. Use calming, empowering statements like, it's okay that I don't know exactly how to do this yet. I can figure it out.
So manage the immediate emotional reaction and inject a little realistic optimism. What about the task itself? The mountain.
This is where the molehill part comes in. You break down the task. Don't try to figure out the whole mountain at once. List all the smaller steps involved. Just brainstorm them without worrying about order. Then break those smaller steps down even further until each individual step feels genuinely doable, like something you could actually sit down and start.
Tiny steps.
Tiny steps. For each tiny piece, ask, what do I know how to do? Where should I start? Who can I ask for help if I get stuck? Organize these tiny steps, maybe into a simple outline.
You're creating a path through the mountain, one step at a time. Makes sense.
Exactly. Once you have those tiny, doable steps, the next crucial action is do one small thing. Pick the easiest step, or maybe the one you dread least, and just do it. It doesn't have to be the first step chronologically.
Just build momentum, get the ball rolling.
Yes. And this step is vital. Give yourself credit for starting. Acknowledge that you took an action against the overwhelm. Then, do another small thing, chipping away at the larger task.
Keep chipping.
Keep chipping. As you complete small steps, you'll understand the overall project better, and you can develop a more specific plan or timeline, always remembering that complex projects usually take longer than you initially estimate.
These strategies, situational leadership, balancing optimism with realism, fostering a growth mindset, using cognitive restructuring, breaking down overwhelming tasks, they all give us concrete ways to shift our perspective and actively choose how we respond to challenges, rather than being passively determined by a default mindset.
They really underscore the powerful idea of learned optimism, that while our initial style might be shaped by our past, we have the agency to learn and implement new cognitive patterns for greater resilience and effectiveness.
And applying these shifts has ripple effects far beyond our internal experience. They impact our well-being, our physical health, and even how we perceive and interact with the broader world, which brings us to Section 5.
The impact is significant and wide-ranging. Our sources detail many benefits associated with optimism.
What are some of the key ones that stand out?
Well, optimism is strongly linked to higher levels of subjective well-being, more frequent positive moods, and better overall morale. It's also associated with greater perseverance when facing obstacles and more effective problem-solving skills.
Which makes intuitive sense. If you believe you can succeed, you're more likely to keep trying different approaches, right?
Exactly. And this perseverance often translates into greater achievement and success across various domains, whether it's academics, career, or personal goals. Interestingly, optimistic people are also often found to be more popular. Yeah, likely because their positive energy and resilience make them better collaborators and companions, maybe easier to be around.
Beyond the psychological and social, there are also compelling links to physical health, right? That seems huge.
Yes, this is a significant area of research. Optimism is associated with engaging in more health-preserving behaviors, perhaps, because optimistic people feel their actions will have a positive outcome, so they bother.
Like exercising or eating well.
Exactly. It's linked to reduced suicidal ideation, and studies even suggest a correlation with longevity and potentially greater freedom from the long-term impacts of trauma. One source specifically highlighted research showing that dispositional optimism acts as a protective factor for older adults against stroke.
Wow, that's a powerful finding, a mindset potentially protecting against serious physical health events like stroke.
The connections are complex, obviously, but the evidence is accumulating. Optimism is also strongly associated with overall psychological well-being. And during major collective stressors, like the COVID-19 pandemic, greater optimism was found to promote resilience and help people maintain their well-being.
So optimism seems to have a lot going for it. But let's revisit pessimism. We discussed its potential benefits in leadership, like risk management. Does it have other protective roles?
It absolutely can. While optimism is often lauded, pessimism isn't without its functional aspects. Its inherent risk-averse nature, as we discussed, leads to more cautious and often safer decisions. It drives preparedness and the development of coping strategies.
It's the internal voice that ensures you pack an umbrella even if the forecast is sunny. The just-in-case voice.
A good analogy. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, the neuroscience news source reported a fascinating finding. While optimism was linked to overall psychological well-being, the absence of pessimism seemed particularly crucial for engaging in health-protective behaviors like masking and social distancing.
The absence of pessimism.
Yeah. And even more strikingly, pessimism itself was associated with behaviors that reduced risk during the pandemic, whereas optimism was not.
Wait, that's really counterintuitive. So being a bit pessimistic might actually have made you more likely to take tangible precautions like wearing a mask.
That's what the correlation suggested in that study. It implies that while optimism helps you feel better emotionally when facing a crisis, a degree of pessimism, perhaps framed as realistic caution or concern about negative possibilities, might be what motivates concrete protective action. It highlights that embracing potential negative realities isn't always debilitating. It can be a powerful motivator for preparedness.
Given these benefits for both mindsets, what are the significant potential downsides or risks we need to be aware of? We talked about unhealthy optimism.
Right. Beyond that example of unhealthy optimism ignoring the need for preparedness, the sources discuss a surprising potential downside related to positive thinking specifically, indulging in positive fantasies about the future.
Positive fantasies, like just daydreaming about success or happiness without a plan.
Yes, pretty much. Research mentioned in the medical news today, source suggests that people who spend a lot of time simply imagining a bright future for themselves may actually be less likely to take the active steps needed to achieve that future.
That completely goes against common self-help advice.
Yeah.
Why would visualizing success make you less motivated? That seems backwards.
Dr. Gabriel Oettingen, a prominent researcher in this area, is quoted stating that indulging in positive fantasies can be a risk factor for depression and mood disorders in the long run, even if it boosts mood short term.
Wow.
Her research indicates these fantasies can be profoundly demotivating. It's hypothesized that you might get a feeling of having already achieved the goal just by vividly imagining it, essentially reaping the emotional reward without expending the effort. So you feel good, but do less.
Wow. It's like a cognitive short circuit that drains your actual drive.
Yeah.
It emphasizes that optimism needs to be linked to agency and action, not just passive visualization. The sources also reiterate the link between the pessimistic explanatory style and poorer physical well-being.
Yes, the pessimistic explanatory style in response to illness article explores a potential mechanism. They suggest that pessimistic individuals, due to their tendency to see no contingency between actions and outcomes, that fatalistic view we talked about, might be less likely to engage in proactive self-care when they are ill.
So if they get sick, the pessimistic mindset says, nothing I do will make a difference, so why bother resting or taking medication or going to the doctor, leading to worse outcomes.
That's the proposed link, which the study investigated by measuring how actively people took steps to manage their illness. It's a compelling idea about how your explanatory style can influence concrete health behaviors, or lack thereof.
We focused a lot on the personal impact, but let's broaden our scope now. How do these mindsets, particularly widespread pessimism, play out on a societal level?
The Our World in Data source presents some truly eye-opening findings about pervasive global misperceptions that lean heavily pessimistic. For instance, a staggering majority of people globally, 52%, believe that extreme poverty is rising worldwide.
Is that true? It feels like bad news travels faster.
Absolutely not. The reality is the opposite. The share of the world's population living in extreme poverty has been declining rapidly for over 2 centuries, and the speed of decline has actually been accelerating in recent decades. Regardless of how you measure it, the data shows dramatic progress.
It's a massive gap between perception and reality. Why do so many people hold such a pessimistic view that is factually incorrect?
The source offers several reasons. First, statistical facts don't always feel intuitive. Our understanding is often heavily biased by vivid personal experiences or anecdotes we hear. Second, news media tends to focus on novel or dramatic events. If it bleeds, it leads.
Right.
While slow, consistent, positive trends like poverty reduction are often ignored because they aren't sudden news. Third, people may be operating with outdated information from years or decades ago. Their mental model hasn't updated.
It suggests a significant breakdown in how information about global progress is communicated and absorbed. The source points toward potential failures in both media and education systems.
They do. And this widespread, factually inaccurate pessimism about global progress has significant political implications. The source argues that if people believe the world is fundamentally not getting better or even getting worse,
then why bother?
exactly. They are less likely to support or demand the very policies and actions that could continue driving positive developments. Why would you try to fix something you believe is inherently broken and unfixable?
Makes sense.
Conversely, if you are aware of the progress that has been made and believe improvement is possible, you are more likely to be motivated to push for the changes needed to achieve further gains. The source also highlights a correlation between knowledge about global development and optimism.
Tell me about that connection. That sounds important.
They found that individuals with the least basic knowledge about global development realities tend to be the most pessimistic about the future. Conversely, those with a good understanding of the factual data are significantly more likely to be optimistic.
So being informed about actual progress correlates with a more hopeful outlook on the future. Knowledge breeds optimism.
That's what the data suggests. Now, correlation doesn't prove causation. Maybe optimistic people are more likely to seek out positive facts, for example, but it strongly implies that factual knowledge plays a significant role in shaping our outlook on the world's potential.
It's a powerful idea. Ignorance about progress fuels pessimism, while knowledge about progress fuels optimism. Or at least they travel together.
It certainly gives us a lot to consider regarding our information diets in the modern age, doesn't it?
This naturally raises a fundamental question. Where do these deep-seated explanatory styles and mindsets even come from in the first place? Section 6 delves into the complex origins, or perhaps mystery surrounding them.
Yeah, the Oxford Handbook source actually describes the origins of explanatory style as a neglected question in the research literature, compared to how much we know about its consequences. It's surprisingly less clear how people initially developed these habitual ways of explaining the world.
Really? That is surprising. So what do we know? What are some of the potential influences that researchers have identified?
Well, there's some evidence suggesting a genetic component. Twin studies indicate that there might be a degree of heritability for optimism.
Okay.
However, the sources caution against thinking there's a single optimism gene. A more likely explanation is that genes might influence other attributes like intelligence, physical attractiveness, or certain personality traits, which in turn might lead to more positive life outcomes and experiences, thereby fostering a more optimistic explanatory style over time.
So it's an indirect influence, mediated by life experiences shaped by genetic predispositions, not just born sunny.
That seems a more nuanced way to look at it. Beyond genetics, explanatory style is also thought to be learned through experience. There's direct acquisition, where you hear explicit causal messages from significant figures in your life, like parents or teachers.
Like hearing, "You're just naturally good at this," versus "You must have worked really hard."
Exactly. If a parent constantly attributes your failures to stable internal factors, you're just not smart enough, or your successes to unstable external luck, you just got lucky this time, those messages can shape your own explanations. We absorb the explanatory patterns modeled by adults.
Makes sense.
And then there's indirect abstraction. This is more internal processing and ruminating on the meaning of past events, particularly failures or traumas, and drawing your own causal conclusions based on that ongoing experience. It's the story you build about why things happen to you over the years.
Trying to make sense of your own life history and solidify a narrative about how the world works and your place in it.
Yes. Parental influence specifically has been studied, but findings are conflicting. Explanatory style is transmitted by some parents, but not universally. This suggests we need to look at moderating factors like how much time parents and children spend together, the actual content of their conversations, and whether causal explanations, why did that happen, are a regular and explicit part of their family discourse.
It's not just having parents present, but the nature of the communication about cause and effect that matters.
Right. Media is also proposed as a potential influence. An older study from 1977 found that even television newscasts modeled helplessness by focusing on problems without agency for resolution.
Interesting.
Potentially offering a form of vicarious learned helplessness. Exposure to violence, whether real in news or fictional, can intensify feelings of risk and insecurity, potentially promoting a more pessimistic or cautious outlook.
And in modern age, social media adds new layers, I imagine.
Absolutely. Passive consumption of social media has been linked to loneliness. And the constant exposure to curated, idealized versions of others' lives can lead to social comparisons that make you feel less happy or successful than your peers, potentially fostering a more pessimistic view of your own life trajectory.
Comparison trap.
Yeah. And the rise of narrowcasting news and information tailored to your existing views could also reinforce a particular explanatory style if it consistently focuses on negative or fear-inducing content without balance.
So the information streams we immerse ourselves in could subtly or overtly be shaping our internal narratives about cause and effect.
It's a significant environmental factor to consider. Finally, exposure to abuse is highlighted as a clear pathway to learned helplessness. Unpredictable punishments or arbitrary control, as seen in studies of abused children, directly teaches the lesson that your actions don't predictably affect outcomes. This fosters that core belief of powerlessness.
That's a heartbreakingly direct route to learned helplessness, considering genetics, direct learning, self-interpretation, family dynamics, media, and trauma. Wow, it's clear the origins are multifaceted and complex.
They are, and the Oxford Handbook source leaves us with a fundamental philosophical question that the research hasn't yet answered. Is there a default explanatory style? Are humans naturally hardwired towards optimism? Is pessimism the default, and optimism requires specific environmental conditions or effort to develop? Or are children relatively blank slates, developing their style based purely on their unique mix of experiences?
That's a profound question. It makes you wonder if our default setting leans one way or the other before life starts layering its lessons on us. It seems there's still much we don't fully understand about the bedrock of these fundamental mindsets.
It really reminds us how complex human development truly is, and how much remains to be discovered about the very roots of our outlook.
As we wrap up our deep dive here, let's explore a concept that some sources suggest might take us beyond the simple optimism versus pessimism frame altogether: the idea of hope.
This is where the conversation can get really interesting, moving beyond binary attitudes. The contraption source introduces a framework where normalcy is defined by whether it's easy to predict if you're on a trajectory towards growth or decline, often oriented around a key future point they call an arrival event.
An arrival event? Like what?
Could be a major goal, a feared crisis, a significant transition, graduation, retirement, something that feels like a destination point.
Kind of like having a clear point on the horizon you're heading towards, for better or worse.
Yes, like a temporal true north. In this view, both optimism and pessimism are seen as forms of horizon thinking. They are deeply rooted in this sense of a significant future event. You interpret the mixed bag of present good and bad events based on whether that anticipated future point is expected to be beneficial, optimism, or negative pessimism.
So your current outlook is colored by what you think is coming down the line. The endpoint dictates the journey's feeling.
Exactly. And in this model, the present now might feel less important because your attention and energy are oriented towards that future arrival event. You have the luxury, in a sense, of a simpler two-arrow model: the past leading to the event and the future after the event. The difference between optimism and pessimism is just whether those arrows point towards good or bad outcomes.
Okay, if that's optimism and pessimism as horizon thinking, where does hope fit into this? Is it different?
The evolution coaching source suggests that authentic hope is sometimes needed in place of simple optimism, particularly when the future isn't clearly predictable or looks challenging. It defines hope not as believing you will succeed, which is closer to optimism's expectation of beneficial outcome, but that it is possible to achieve a desired future and that your effort will be worthwhile regardless of the guaranteed outcome.
That distinction is crucial. It's possibility and effort, not certainty of success. Hope is about the maybe.
Exactly. It's not blind faith or wishful thinking. Authentic hope, according to the source, requires reasons. It must pick out credible features in the current situation, even small, nascent possibilities that make the desired future outcome plausible, even if not probable or guaranteed.
So it has to be grounded in reality, even if that reality is difficult or uncertain. It needs some evidence, however small.
Yes. And hope must be fallible. It's ready to confront the possibility of ruin or failure. It's not a cheerful disposition that assumes everything will be fine anyway.
It acknowledges the risk.
Right.
Hope demands recognizing the possibility of something that isn't necessarily obvious from the status quo, something that wouldn't happen automatically, something that requires active striving, commitment, and intentionality, even when the odds are long or failure is a real possibility.
That reframes hope from a passive feeling into an active, realistic, and potentially difficult striving for a better future that is merely possible. It acknowledges complexity and risk in a way simple optimism might gloss over.
It's perhaps more resilient and grounded orientation for navigating uncertain or challenging times, focusing on the value of the effort and the potential for change, rather than relying on an expectation of guaranteed success.
What a journey. We've navigated from the simple glass-half-full idea to the sophisticated science of explanatory style, tracing its roots in learned helplessness, exploring practical techniques for shifting our perspective, examining the profound impact of these mindsets on health and society, wrestling with the complex and mysterious origins, and finally, contemplating hope as a distinct and perhaps more robust orientation than simple optimism or pessimism. We've definitely seen that optimism and pessimism each offer distinct strengths, resilience and drive on one hand, preparedness and caution on the other. Neither is a universally superior mode. The most effective approach often involves developing awareness, flexibility, and the ability to blend realistic assessment with a belief in possibility.
And understanding explanatory style, those 3 Ps, gives us a powerful lens for seeing the internal stories we tell ourselves about why things happen.
Yeah.
Giving us leverage to use techniques like cognitive restructuring and task breakdown to challenge unhelpful patterns and regain agency.
We've also uncovered surprising nuances, the potential demotivating effect of passive positive fantasies, which is so counterintuitive, and the unexpected link between pessimism and proactive risk reduction behaviors during a crisis like the pandemic.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And on the societal level, the data on global misperceptions is a stark reminder of how powerful collective mindsets can be, and how a distorted view of reality can fuel pessimism about humanity's capacity for progress.
Which brings us back to that compelling correlation between factual knowledge about global development and optimism about the future. Something really worth thinking about.
So what does all of this mean for you, our listener? These concepts aren't confined to textbooks or labs. Your personal explanatory style shapes how you perceive challenges, how you react to setbacks, your resilience in the face of adversity, how you lead or interact with others, and even how you interpret the news and the state of the world. These dynamics are actively shaping your experience right now.
And understanding these mindsets and the techniques for influencing them provides you with tools to gain more conscious control over your reactions, build resilience, and choose perspectives that are both grounded in reality and conducive to growth and well-being. It's about agency.
And here's a final thought to leave you with, something to mull over. If knowing the facts about global progress tends to correlate with a more optimistic view of the future, what responsibility does that place on each of us, individually and collectively, to actively seek out accurate, evidence-based information, to challenge misperceptions, and to understand the world as it actually is, not just as it's often portrayed or how we might pessimistically assume it to be?
Something worth considering as you go about your day. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.